And welcome to Nasrec. And of course, I'm joined now by analyst Angelo Fick, because there is so much that we are expecting. And Angelo, thanks so much for joining me here. I was actually thinking, last night, is this going to be more of a Polokwane moment? Is it going to be more of a Mangaung moment? Are we going to see a bit of both, or are we going to see something completely new here?
Well, I think this is a moment sui generis. It's a moment of its own. Who knows what is going to happen? I don't think we've been in a situation where days before the conference, the parliamentary deployment of the ANC has to save its president from illegal trouble in order to contest the elective conference for a second term. So I think we're in slightly new territory, and whether or not the party and its delegates decide that they want to repeat Polokwane or Mangaung, or whether they want to invent a whole new way of dealing with their internal struggles, I think remains to be seen.
And I think the reason why I went for Polokwane or Mangaung was Polokwane, it was really, really bruising, to a point where I remember being on air on the night when the announcement was made of the winner of the presidency of the ANC. And I actually remember saying, I will feel sorry for the loser, whoever it is, because it was just such an attritional, such a bruising battle. And then you had Mangaung, where it was basic consolidation for the Zuma faction in Mangaung. So I'm looking at this, and from what happened in the last elective conference here at Nasrec in 2017, and I'm thinking either Cyril Ramaphosa is going to consolidate, or this thing is going to split the ANC further.
Or many of the other options that come to mind is that they limp ahead as they did between 2017 and 2022, with an NEC divided down the middle, with a top six official sector that isn't quite as coherent as it should be. Let's not forget that you now have somebody acting in three of those positions. And you can't have that going into the 2024 election. So I think the ANC knows what its challenges are. I'm just not certain that the party discipline is there throughout the organization, and this is something that they've been admitting for at least 10 years, in order to realize this is no longer you have 10 years to fix it. This is triage. You are bleeding out and you need to staunch the wounds. And that requires cooperation from people at every level in the party to put the party interest or the organization interest above their individual ambition to get onto a list, to get into power, to get control over the diminishing levers of government control that allows you patronage networks get access to those resources.
To that point, is that still up to the ANC though? Do they still have that sort of leverage over society and the electorate? Or is this just, do what you do, we'll do what we do?
So I don't think we're quite at that position, because let's not forget that the ANC, despite being as wounded as it is, calls in support during elections above 50%. Historically, and that's often a percentage that parties elsewhere in the world look to with envy. This is a world in which coalition politics governs so much of what is happening in political spaces. And South Africa, I think, is in a space where coalition politics haven't worked out so well because of these fights between parties and because of the inexperience of managing coalitions. So the ANC is not yet in a position where it can say, or it has to say, you do you and we do ourselves. The ANC is still in a position where it calls on the majority and wants the majority to vote for it, and its most recent electoral performances, diminished as they are compared to its heyday in the 90s and early 2000s, is such that they still want those people to be behind them. They don't want to have to form a coalition government in 2024 because they have no good experience of that at municipal level, so at national level one imagines it's going to be worse. And they also don't want to have to go in with just on 50%. They want to have a strong mandate because they then have their eye on the next election, which is 2029. The ANC's position has never been short-term survival. And so the question is, do they want to get into that position a century after starting? Because that means once you have those as your goals, we've seen that for other parties, short-term survival leads to short-term demise.
So if we look at the history of coalition politics in South Africa, and as you say, it hasn't really worked well, except for a few green shoots somewhere around the country at the local municipal level. Would that sort of situation and the narrative that springs from that, would that benefit the ANC, do you think, in the long run?
No. So what we know from these coalitions is that the strongest partner in terms of numbers is often at the mercy of very small players who can push and shift their allegiance and take them out of power. People in Johannesburg and Tshwane have experience of this. So the African National Congress, I think, would prefer to have an outright victory, because that means that they're firmly in control and can implement their plans and also service their patronage networks. What I think the citizens need is precisely that, a coalition of partners who will work towards the outcomes rather than jockey for positions and control over levers. But that means that politicians have to take longer-term survival of the society over short-term control and, of the purse and of the ability to disburse favors to people inside their networks. And that's something that I think our politicians haven't yet learned. And the irony is that the majority of the people in politics in South Africa have no option B. So it's not as if they can go offshore and go and live in the Channel Islands or in Mayotte or in Mauritius. They're here, their families are here, and therefore, like the rest of us, having made our stand here, the longer-term survival of the society is what's in play. So listening to Ms. Kubai earlier talking to you, the question that I have is, yes, you have the next 2 to 5 years in mind, but do you have in mind the next 40 to 50 years in which your children and grandchildren have to struggle? Because that, after all, was the project of this party between 1912 and 1994. It wasn't short-term survival. It was, one, the long-term liberation of black people's lives in colonial South Africa, 2, opposition to legislated apartheid and white supremacy, and then 3, the building of an inclusive, socially democratic society. In some places, they've done this on paper, but the economy hasn't democratized, the delivery of services isn't democratized, so what you have is inequality not just of income and wealth distribution, but you have inequality of access to life chances. A child born in Diepsloot does not have the same life chances as a child born in Waterkloof or in Constantia. And this is, I think, a failure of a liberation movement become governing party, that many of the inequalities of the colonial and apartheid systems it opposed remains in place for very many millions of people under its administration.
And then the million-dollar question is, why has it remained in place when the struggle for liberation was in the main to address those particular issues? So why haven't they made more strides to actually eradicate all of those inequalities in society?
So one of their oldest cadres, and somebody or longest standing cadres, let me not use oldest, Ronnie Kasrils, who was Deputy Minister of Defence in the 90s, said that they'd underestimated what neoliberal capitalism's power was in the negotiation of the settlement in the 1990s. And many of the policies implemented by the ANC, they do begin to look fairly neoliberal. And it's not surprising. One thinks of just
they
a
look
rumour
or they
mill.
are.
Well, they would argue that they are not. And so I can't at this point say they are not, because there's also a gap between written policy and implementation of plans. Let's not forget this is a country in which the Minister of Communication defied her own party and did not implement the digital migration policy, which set us back a decade in terms of development goals. So we write things on paper, but what we do in practice, or what the governing party does in practice, is also very different. There's talk, as Mameloko Kubai told you, of the unbundling of Eskom, but we've been limping along with an unbundled, and that's an awkward phrasing, Eskom, and an energy crisis for well on 10 years now. This is not new. This is not new developments. These are people suggesting now that we've reached triage. Oh, by the way, we should have bought better bandages, right? So my concern here is that this is a party that speaks the speak on occasion, and then sometimes does some implementation that walks the talk, but a lot of the other times it does not walk the talk. It speaks anti-corruption, and then people implicated in maladministration and corruption march alongside the president in his campaigns for re-election, not just in the party, but in the country. We sit with a situation where people who have been convicted of all sorts of problems and sometimes criminal misconduct, who've served prison sentences, have their records squashed in order to stand again for election. The question is, at what point, and this is when Jabulo Ndebele's point in 2006 was, instead of just asking who is corrupt and who is the new corrupt person, ask what makes corruptibility possible. And what makes corruptibility possible in South Africa is that there is no final accountability. There is always 5 ways to implement the rules and 10 ways around those rules. And that's not just an ANC problem, that's a societal problem. And until as South Africans we do not put up with this, our politicians across the political spectrum don't have to respond.
But why would South Africans not put up with it? South Africans, I would argue, would rather be coerced into doing the same, or co-opted even in certain instances into doing the same, because this is what's happening at the very top. And it seems to be working for those who are involved in it, and they seem to get away with it. And it goes down to the lowest level where people have to bribe somebody to get their child into a school of their choice. So we seem to be doomed in that regard as a society.
Not really. I think that we may feel that we're doomed, but we cannot. Despair is not an option. I hate to quote Greta Thunberg, but despair is a luxury we can ill afford. We have a crisis on our hands and we need to intervene. And that means ordinary South Africans in their stokvels, in their community organizations, in their sports clubs, in their religious organizations, in their factories, on their work surfaces, where they work, on the floor, the shop floor, need to start realizing that they're building a society. And if they build it via corrupt means, that's the society they're leaving their children and their children's children. So don't bribe to get your child into school. Report that issue. And then if the politician doesn't respond, then you need to collectively organize as a society to get rid of that. And we've seen people do this. We've seen communities stand together, and we call these community protests, service delivery protests, to refuse that they're simply going to go quietly into that good night. And that, I think, is our only way out. Because to succumb to the opposite and to say, well, whatever we need to do is what we're going to do to get the way done, is to doom not just ourselves in the short term, but to doom those who come after us. And instead of thinking of ourselves as owners of the country, we need to begin to think of ourselves as custodians of this moment. And as custodians of this moment, we need to keep it intact and hand it on to the next generation. And then again, instead of thinking we own the country, we need to think of ourselves as belonging to it. And if we belong to it, those who come after us must also have a chance to belong to something that we have kept intact.
So what have we kept intact for the next generation?
Well, the challenge is we need to keep intact, one, the spirit of refusal to buckle under. And that's what communities have shown us. If we think of the community action networks, the CANs during the pandemic, of people coming together to make sure that people don't go hungry, that their children are fed, that there is some kind of life that sustains itself. That can-do spirit should become part of the way in which we do democracy. Two, we need to demand that the economy be democratized. This business of building 100 black industrialists is again to create a little elite that then says there'll be trickle-down. Trickle-down economics has worked nowhere in the world. And so South Africans need to take ownership of the processes to feel that they belong to the country and that the society is theirs to live in and through, not to hand it over to leaders who are politicians who speak in their name but don't deliver to their needs. And that means thinking more productively and critically. Those who are elected to parliament should send their children to public schools. There should be a regulation. They should use.
Where is that going to happen?
Regulations. If we demand
Which regulations? Who comes up with those regulations?
If we demand it, if we go to parliament, participate in those processes, we live in a society where we have the democratic means to demand those things.
Angelo, we've just come out of a week where a parliament that actually set up the rules for how to impeach a president went back on themselves, essentially, by saying, okay, we need an independent expert panel, draw up a report to just give us, some sort of way forward in terms of whether this process should or should not go ahead. And then they castigate the same report that they commission and then vote against it. So, you look at things like those where a party can use its majority in parliament to certainly sway and have their way. But how then does that give hope to ordinary South Africans that things can actually change if we don't have real structural change?
So one, I don't think we need to live on hope alone. I think we need to live on action. We don't have to have only hope. We can make that hope actionable. And those actions include, one, objecting to processes by writing to Parliament as citizens and going through the processes of representing your view. Secondly, when it comes to elections, to vote for people and vote out people who do not do what you need them to do. And that also requires civic kind of understandings of how the state works. And I suspect that for the majority of South Africans, democracy is an exercise once every 5 years. And we are no longer in a situation where that can be the case. We need to intervene constantly, continuously, all the time. And that means knowing the processes, intervening in them, and not just signing the petitions, but actually making sure that when we have to go and vote in by-elections and elections, we don't vote for people that we say between those elections we don't trust and don't deliver for us, to make better and different choices for ourselves and for those for whom we hold the world in custody.
which speaks to civic education, which speaks to more active citizenry in South Africa, and not leaving it to the 4,250 delegates that are here at Nasrec. Well, Angelo Fick is one of the analysts that we will be speaking throughout the day here on SABC. And just a reminder, it is the ANC's 55th National Congress, and the SABC's got you covered. Radio, TV, digital platforms, we are there online. So please choose your poison and follow us as we bring you blow-by-blow coverage. Let me hand you back to the studio in Auckland Park. We're going to take a quick break before we say goodbye on Morning Live. But from Morning Live at Nasrec, it's goodbye.